A hand turned, followed by the familiar creaking sound of a door. The quick thumps of rapid footfall carried onward as a shadow loomed into the open corridor. A girl let out a screech at the top of her lungs. "Oh my god, Derek, what the hell?" exclaimed one of Kristen's friends, who jumped back startled as she nearly stopped on me without notice. I was seated on the floor a few feet from the door, never realizing I might frighten someone had they decided to run out of the room without minding their surroundings. The startling yelp of the girl had scared me just as much as I had scared her, and I fell back onto my hands and crawled half a foot back. When I looked up to her, I saw her looking down at me in confusion. I threw on a quick smile to remedy the situation. "Hi," I said. The girl swung her head around in a mild gesture of aggravation. Her long blonde hair trailed behind its swooping arc. She threw me a sarcastic look, rolled her eyes, and proceeded downstairs. Kristen came next. "What are you doing?" she asked, looking down at me in the same confusion. "Nothing." "Whatever." She spat angrily as though I was at fault for her hangover. She followed her friend down the stairs to the first floor, seeming irritated at everything around her, a clear and evident consequence of having to suffer the costly side effects of late-night revelry. A terrible choking scent of perfume and other cover-up scent applicants flowed out from the room, and I leapt up from the floor and covered my face with my arm to avoid the toxic cloud that threatened to wound my masculinity. The climb down the stairs was an interesting one. Despite there being no bodies on its surface like there was earlier in the night, there was a wide array of empty cans, lost items, usually drug-related, and articles of clothing that was dispensed for reasons I couldn't fathom. The light that breached through the windows highlighted every misplaced object throughout the house with a glittering reflection. My assumption was that the rise of the sun must have awoken the zombies that was laid throughout the house and forced them to scurry into shadows for shelter. I took a quick look at the basement door and decided to stay away from there for a day or two before I forget about my established reasoning for doing so. I peeked into the living room corner as I came by it, remembering the events from throughout the night. I was happy to see that nobody resided on the couch and the half-filled drinks were left on the table side, which suggested a sudden evacuation had underwent. After a quick feel through the area, I could tell there was nobody else in the house but Kristen, her friend, and, well, I, of course. My father must have snuck off to work early in the morning without making comment, a trait that was only common of him. The absence of the bodies throughout the house may have been his workings, and I dared not imagine how the high schoolers managed to drive home in their drunken states. As much as I wanted David out of this world, I didn't want to think of his reckless tendencies consuming the lives of innocents. It always seemed that the drunks were the ones who would survive such horrible roadside tragedies, while the late-night driving family suffered the consequence. Kristen and her friend were on the stools by the kitchen counter. Neither spoke a word to another, besides a few groans here and there that expressed how they felt. They did an amazing job at replicating each other's gestures, as both had their right palm pressed into their forehead, and they leaned onto their elbows with their hurting heads. Breakfast was probably not happening today. I sneaked around them quietly, trying to avoid making any sudden noise that may cause either of them to snap. I carefully grabbed a glass out of the cabinet, which required me to spring up to my toes for that needed extra inch, and I compassed the cup in both my hands to avoid the small chance of dropping it. I filled it at the water fountain at the front of the fridge, which only made a slight tickling sound that was rather tranquil. Strategically, I avoided the ice cube dispenser, knowing the noise generated by that would be anything but relaxing. I went to drink my freshly made beverage, but after being smacked with a considerate idea, I filled another glass and placed it on the counter in front of my sister and her friend. The girls gave a quick and rather reluctant thanks, and proceeded to sip it slowly before resting their heads back onto the palms of their hands. I wasn't far off from joining them. After filling a cup for myself, I placed it on the countertop and hopped onto a stool. I felt the aching tiredness pulling from the back of my eyes, and it hit me that I hadn't actually slept well that night. I rested into a lethargic posture by resting my chin into the cup of my two hands to allow my neck some rest from holding up my head for so long. Nobody spoke a word. Everyone sat awkwardly silent, feeling the seeping tiredness behind their eyes. I more so than the girls, but they had the headache to complain about, as I was simply just sleep-deprived. If I were to just close my eyes for just a second, I imagined I would have fell asleep that very instant, and just to tempt myself, I shut them, like a prolonged blink only to open them again and feel the brightness of the morning sun burning into my iris. The girls were off in the corner of my view and remained still, without a noise, and I paid them little attention. The view outside my house was warming, though, remotely unanimated, and the buzzing rays of the sun seemed to vibrate the world around me. The energy of life was in the air, but so was the nagging drought of dehydrated brain matter that came from the side of my view. My mind was very relaxed, and normally my frantic, borderline hyperactive behavior would never allow me to remain so still. But for this one moment it was possible, and rather amazing. Feeling a dry hoarseness in my throat, I reached for the glass in front of me. It was a strange feeling, almost difficult, like my hand was restrained by elastic bands and did not want to move from its position. My reach fell short, as it was forcefully pulled back to my position, and I threw my hand forward in compensation of the added resistance. In doing so, my hand crashed into the side of the glass and tipped it over, leaving its cold contents to spill across the table as the structure of the cup shattered once impacted onto the countertop. The distinct crash of the glass woke me from my trance. That was when I realized both my hands were still rested underneath my chin. "Christ, Derek," shouted Kristen, as she jumped off her stool and grabbed a cloth by the sink. As Kristen frantically cursed me while mopping up the mess, I turned slowly to my side and watched as Kristen's friend lifted her head from her hand just enough to register what happened, and then proceeded to flop back down onto her arm in exhaustion. She didn't see a single thing. I was hoping to get a confirmation that I actually knocked over the glass with my hand, but considering everyone had their heads down, I was left to my own hypothesis, frankly. I'm just too tired to think straight. Kristen started ranting about all the troubles I had given her, and she went over to a medicine cabinet and threw down several blood thinners as if to highlight the idea that I was only worsening her headache. Kristen's friend got the attention off me when she offered to go out for breakfast, and without hesitation, the girl rose from her seat, saying that she'd go start the car. I thought that would have been a great means to elevate Kristen's mood, but the moment I was left alone with her again, she started right back up. I handled it very well. Normally I would have loved to throw back all kinds of defensive statements like, "No, I didn't," and "That's a lie," but my sleepiness had me just sit back and absorb every word she was firing out of her rapid sputtering jaw. For the most of it, I didn't even hear a single word she was saying. It was like a mild ambience, easily ignored and somewhat relaxing. She broke me out of the silent state when she came by and pinched the shoulder of my shirt. "Derek, and how long have you been wearing that shirt? Just because you're at home this week doesn't mean you don't need a change. Get up there and take a shower, you're filthy." She barked at me like a drill sergeant. I turned and looked at her with a curious state. I was filthy? Did she not see the filth that littered the house last night? All of who, by the way, were buddies of that boyfriend of hers, which she so eagerly embraced the previous day. I knew she was slowly losing it. "When I come back, you better be in clean clothes and look decent. David's coming by again today, and I don't want him thinking I live with a slob." And there went my day. "David's a jerk," I shouted, breaking from my cool state and leaping off the stool. I should have probably stayed on the stool as it gave me the height to look my sister straight in the face, but now I was forced to look up at her, demeanoring my own stature. "Derek, I don't want to hear it. He wants to hurt you. He was saying bad things about you. Derek, just shut up. I know you don't like him, so don't go off making things up about him. It won't change my opinion," Kristen stated. She walked past me and straight out the front door where her friend was waiting in the car, unwilling to hear her anymore. So I may have lied in my past, but it was never done in a serious manner. It was always over just a small thing, a joke really, nothing more, and that was when it came to me. The fact that I had never actually lied to my sister to such a degree, never in my life when it came to a serious thing like this, and to have her assume that I would make up such a thing because of personal prejudice, sunk a strange feeling of abandonment in me. I thought she would always believe me when it came down to it, but to be shut down like that without a chance, well, what was I to do? David was truly blinding her from all things. He was a shade to her light. I went straight upstairs and did nothing but obeyed. Being a little tired, I started the bath as I preferred to take a sedative approach to the whole cleaning business. I was in a fog and didn't really want to commit my brain power to the dispute that had just taken place. With the amount of sister drama I've had in the past, such a thing as what just happened blew over easily, and I rested into the warm waters of the bath, allowing my mind to drift. David was a jerk. I knew she would see it, given enough time. I just had to make it more apparent, and there was nothing wrong with hastening the inevitable conclusion of one's character, was there? I knew my sister would find out sooner or later, and I thought it was better now than after she already grew attached to him. That was all assuming she wasn't already glued to the guy as it is. But how would I go about doing all that was a question I needed to answer. He was coming over today, again, after already having been here late last night. I took a mental note to stay away from the pool area for the day, as I wasn't fond of swallowing chlorinated water by the gallon, though baiting him in for another drowning session may help to provoke my sister into disliking him. My mind flooded with ideas and imaginations. It was not always easy exposing people for who they really are, but then again, David was an asshole, and never tried to hide it. I began to fear that such a personality trait may have been the very thing my sister found attractive in him. It would explain the consistency in the previous boyfriends. There had to be a reason why she chose all of them in particular. She was into jerks. Plain and simple. Forget it then, I thought. My sister clearly would not work with me on this, and I could not rely on her emotional attachment to me, as she didn't appear to have any as long as David was present, or if he was the topic of mind. It was up to me and only me. I'd have to take him down myself, though I didn't know how I'd go about that. I recalled my experience in the lunchroom with the two bullies. I had never gotten into a fight before, but I handled that one rather well, and it was a 2-on-1 situation, as opposed to just one. Both the bullies had bested me in size, but David was a bit different. The bullies were still middle schoolers, and David was far older and bigger than that. Still, my confidence presumed. I had a chance. It could be done. I swam out into the deep end, baiting him in. If he came at me, this would be it. Without the support of my sister, I decided I would have to do it myself. I would hold him underwater until he felt the clutches of death grabbing at him, until he regretted ever coming over and seeking out my sister, until he feared enough to forever leave her alone. He was looking at me. I swam around at my leisure, soaking up the cooling properties of the water, looking innocent in my personal ocean. It drew jealousy from him, a terrible and potent resentment. He could not stand to witness the luxury of others. Just jump on in, I whispered to myself. I was ready. He ignored me and went to retaliate in his own sadistic way. Heading toward my sister, he dived his face into hers, and the two exchanged saliva in the most grossest of fashions. I couldn't see how it was attractive at all. I wouldn't have ever done that. I wouldn't have ever done half of that to the prettiest girls I knew. He looked at me out of the corner of his eyes, drawing in the anger that boiled within me from having to watch him drool over my sister. I knew a way to get at him. A way to get him into the waters, into the seas of his folly. "Hey, David," I shouted and waited for him to look up. "What is that pill in your pocket?" He turned sharply, furious, eyes laid upon me. "Don't eat you even," he snarled like a beast from hell, his voice impossibly loud as it reverberated off the surface. He ran at me with alarming speed, leaping high into the air before smashing through the calm surface of the water. Giant waves reached over my head, and a powerful undercurrent pulled me deep into the growing wake as my ability to swim was overwhelmed by the exaggerated effects of the turbulent waters. Looking up into the distancing sky, I was pulled deeper by the hooked talons of an outer-worldly predator. I would not be able to reach the surface in time before my lungs became void of life. Choking in water, I began to drown. Rising out of the water, I expelled the fluid from my lungs in a series of frantic coughs and tried to remain upright with my head clear of the water. I must have fell asleep. Leaning back against the tub again, I rested my head on the lip's edge, still feeling the heightened adrenal response from nearly drowning. My emotions from the vision remained as my thoughts were blown away by the vividness of the dream. The fear was gripping. It felt so real. And the warning would not go unheeded. I thought it better to not challenge David directly, as the dream was clear enough indication to me that it would not work as planned. I would not give up that easily when it came to bringing David down. He may be able to best me physically, but as far as brains went, he was a dud. I was sure I had the upper hand in those grounds. If I was ever going to beat him, it'd have to be done with a battle of wits. The water was no longer warm, and it reached that icky room temperature feel that happens only when one is in the bath for far too long. I decided it was time to get out. The surface of the water rippled quickly and chorusing with the vibrations from the wall. When I came out of the water and stood on the bathroom tile floor, the room felt stranger than when I first had entered it. Now that I noted it, it never felt strange at all to begin with. For some odd reason, instead of reaching for the towel, which would be instinctive for any modest individual, I thought it best to go straight for the door, which I did. Though this proved a problem, as when I went to feel the door, which I normally wouldn't do without a particular reason, and it was just a door that lacked any notable exciting properties, but when I went to feel the door, well, I went right through it. Naturally, I'd be rather alarmed having gone through the door without opening it, especially being in the nude, but this was not exactly a normal situation. I did not feel as though I was in my body, well, for that matter. I wouldn't have cared that much for being seen in the nude after exploring such a phenomenon as passing through a solid object. What else could have been as significant as having done that? As impressive as it may all sound, I did not look back at the door or anything for that matter. I just went to reach for my necklace, which was always priority. When I realized I had no hands, I got worried. How am I to know where I am? I went to walk on, but movement was limited, like being trapped in a circulating current of air, or more so, liberated by the free-flowing imagination. I had surfaced gently into the air and floated my way through the house. The house was the same for the most part, and though I did not necessarily have a body, I could feel textures, see colors, and had I tried, I'm sure I could have tasted things. I refrained from the latter for obvious reasons. Things were going fine for being such an unusual experience, but the moment I descended the stairs in glide-like fashion and came to the site of the living room, a vast explosion of images coruscated before me. They were lifetimes of memories, emotions, and events all played out over one another. Every image before me came with a crippling sensation that shaped me into the incarnate forms of the emotions within the room. Profound joy traveled throughout me in an ecstatic bliss as the sight of my sister and I, at a much younger age, ran eagerly to the pile of presents beneath a tall and radiant Christmas tree. A warm blanket of love cuddled me in a protective grip as I watched the three of us, our father included, sitting down to a family movie night. Horror creaked at the edges of my essence, stretching my form in painful directions as I witnessed my favorite dog dying a second time on the living room floor from an incurable disease that tore at his heart one beat at a time. I fought for control as emotion ran out of check and my mind was quickly becoming exhausted. I focused on the current day, the state in which I knew the room was in. The transparent display of past events faded until unseen, leaving the room the mess left upon it in stable visual state. Looking down into the beer cans thrown about on the stained rug, I began to see the vague outline of my father before he expanded into full contrast. He knelt before a pile of family pictures that were scattered throughout the room indiscriminately, looking at each of them while tears of remorse streamed down his face. He let out a painful scream as he reached for a can of beer and an endless line of more. He cracked it open and proceeded to drink it vigorously and with unrelenting fever. As he gulped down its contents in one giant effort, the picture he was looking at earlier faded into the ground and he crashed the bottom of the can right where the picture had previously been. I felt a vast emptiness in me, as though the life that I had lived was being erased faster than I could recall it. Like a panning cinematic camera, I swung around the room and shut the image of my father out of the corner of my eyes. I could not feel the pain any longer. I wanted to forget it all. I needed release, and looked upon the other half of the room in hopes of escape. On the sofa before me was David. The room grew dark and shaped itself in the form it had taken the very night before. The conversations I heard the night I had sat next to him was replaying to me, but my form took a drastic change for worse. I was no longer freely floating around throughout the room, and instead I found myself sitting on the sofa with a child under my left arm and three of my friends scattered around. My entire body was numb and I felt untouchable. The three friends of mine regarded me with emboldening admiration, and I felt on top of the world. The boy to my left had no significant purpose to me. I cared nothing for him, only that he was connected to my ultimate goal, his sister. I wanted to infect her, to seed her with my hateful thirst, my hungering desires. Her soul would be swallowed whole by me, and it would be done by no one else. Then I would be worshipped by the men who could only dream of being where I had gone, by those friends that I had hoped to bring under my rule of popularity. My living form had been cast out, shot from the piercing vision of David, and my sight passed through the furniture and the wall that led into the kitchen. My sister stood before me, and when she came into sight, a terrible evil screamed at me as though part of David still existed within me. The darkness had lifted and the house restored itself to daylight. But as the objects around the house repositioned themselves, my sister still remained. She shouted my name. "Derek, where are you?" asked Kristen, looking around. I knew she could not see me, for I was aloft right before her eyes, and she just looked on through me like still air. She ran up the stairs and nudged her head into the door of my room. I followed her, as close as my astral form could permit, but my movements were hindered, as though I had to bend the air current in her direction. She called my name again, with her head out of sight inside my room. When she had returned back to the corridor, she held a look of concern on her face. She turned and looked in the direction of the bathroom, seeing the interior light on from a bottom gap of the floor. "Derek, are you still in there?" she asked. It had not occurred to me at the time that my physical form must have remained in the living dimension. I was still there in the world that I am observing my sister in, the one I had left behind. A great concern overwhelmed me as I wondered how I could return to my body, and I feared thinking I'd be forced to witness the shock on my sister's face when she looked upon me in such a lifeless state. As though in response to my concern, a gripping force yanked at my core, almost like that of a terrible gut feeling, and I was yanked from the air where I previously watched from. My sight had passed through my sister and into the door she was knocking heavily upon, and then directly into the body that laid there, half submerged in water. I splashed wildly as I connected back into my body. "Derek, what the hell are you doing in there?" Kristen asked, as she heard nearly every object in the bathroom fall over at once, most of which were far out of reach. It was hard to speak, but I tried anyway, and the effort caused a stressing groan which I couldn't differentiate whether it was formed by tongue or casted from the alternative world. Why was it so difficult to speak? "What was that?" my sister asked. She was about to come in. Nothing, I'm fine," I shouted, now relaxed after concluding the suspense of not knowing when or if ever I would have gained control of my body again. "Have you been in there the whole time?" "No, I just got in." Or at least I'd convinced myself of that. How long had I been in here? "Well, hurry it up." I got up quickly and grabbed a towel. The self-preserving dignity in the action alone was what set the difference in my state of reality and made me realize I was once again myself. I checked for my necklace. It was there, the thin, weaving strands of gold, held by the two angels to either end, encompassing the emerald gem at the center. The angels were dormant, sleeping away as they should have been. I had returned.